Hi, this is Andrew Marty from SACS, and the topic for today is what makes a good remote worker. When we started on this venture some 5 or 6 months ago, I was fascinated to see what we would be able to find in the research world. But in fact, there has been much research about what makes a really good remote worker. So we're going to look at that research today, and we're going to outline for you what that research means, but we're also going to suggest some things that you might like to do to optimize the success of your remote working employees. So first, to set some objectives for this presentation. The whole presentation is about showing you what makes a good remote worker. And then we're going to look at some characteristics which relate to that question. Cognitive ability, how smart the person is. Personality and values. The person's personality is something that's extremely stable over the course of their life. Values can change, but tend often to be stable. Do these have an effect on whether somebody is likely to be a good remote worker or not? Also, competencies. So a person's skills, a person's knowledge and experience, a person's attitudes and values, do they affect whether they're likely to be an effective remote worker or not? And then we're going to show you a thing called the SACS Remote Worker Online Assessment, which you will be able to try if you are inclined to do so. So firstly, let's just ask the question of what do we mean by a good remote worker? SACS is in the scientist practitioner model of business, which is that we have a very strong interest in primary research, undertake a number of research projects with universities like Deakin University. And one of the things that we need to do in science is you need to define your terms. And the first term we need to define is that, okay, well, what do we mean by a good remote worker? We believe that there are two key aspects to being an effective remote worker. Key aspect number one is the well-being of the employee. If the well-being is high in a remote worker, then we say that's a good remote worker. Now, there are a bunch of things that affect that person's well-being, and we will deal with these in turn. But historically, the model of well-being that was used in psychology is what's often called the medical model, which is to say that somebody is considered to have high levels of well-being if they have an absence of things like anxiety or depression. And the question you need to ask there is, will remote working damage this person? Will it make them more anxious, more depressed, more obsessive, more whatever? So that's an important question to ask. But psychology these days tends to take what we call a positive psychology approach. And positive psychology is about growth. It's about development. It's about positivity and experience. So is this person engaged in their work? That's a classic positive psychology question. So it's not enough not to be anxious. Is this person actually engaged in their work, which means that they will be committed to it, energetic, which means that they will take satisfaction in it. And by the way, if you measure engagement, that's also a good predictor of work performance. Second thing is, are they resilient? And is their resilience improving? Which is to say, if a person has high levels of well-being, resilience is the capacity to maintain those high levels of well-being irrespective of what life tosses them. So is the resilience sound, and is it improving? And also, of course, will this person continue to grow? Which is to say, it's not enough that the person does their job. In a truly positive environment with high levels of well-being, the person should be improving their skills, improving their confidence, and improving what we would call self-efficacy. And we're going to be using that term a fair bit later on when we talk about competencies. But self-efficacy is the belief in the person that they can get this stuff done well. A person who has high self-efficacy is somebody who has confidence in themselves and their capabilities. So, item number one in what makes a good remote worker is well-being. Item number two is performance, of course. And so some people are able to work in a remote location and some people are not. And so this is a very old model. You may have come across this, Hersey and Blanchard, a thing called situational leadership. I mean, I'm quoting this because it's very well known, and it's also has a level of, or a certain style of supervision that works well for them, a directing style of supervision. So the first day in a new organization, you're likely to get high levels of directiveness from your supervisor. Once you develop more experience, you move from a directing, telling kind of model of leadership to a coaching style of model where you're being, once more, it's highly directive, but there's also high supportive behavior where the person's beginning to develop confidence in their capabilities. and the leader is encouraging them to develop that confidence. Then you've got low directive and high supportive behavior, where you're really supporting the person as they develop their skills. And then finally, when the person's become very mature in the job, then you're delegating to them. And in fact, you're also probably consulting them for their opinion. So this is supportiveness and this is directiveness. And what we see is that as people mature in their experience, they move from quadrant S1, S2, S3, S4. Now, what has this got to do with remote work? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. Somebody who is brand new in an organization, if you've got them working remotely, you have to find a way of spending more time with them to give them clarity of direction. And you also have to find a way to make sure that they are appropriately supported, whatever quadrant they're in, to make sure that their psychological and well-being needs are being taken care of. On the other hand, if a person is an absolute master at a particular job, sending them remote is much less likely to affect their levels of performance and perhaps their well-being as well, depending on their makeup. And we'll be talking about personality and values in just a second. But what we're saying here is that if a person's very mature in a job, they're probably likely to find remote work less challenging than somebody who's brand new in a job. So the level of maturity matters. But then there's also the question of whether they're going to do good stuff or bad stuff. Now, these are examples of 10 counterproductive work behaviors. SACS measures this in prospective hires for many organizations. So these are counterproductive work behaviors. They're bad things that people do at work, and came originally from a very big study conducted about 15 years ago by researchers in the United States of America, including Paul Sackett, where he asked the question of many organizations, what are common behaviors that negative behaviors that employees do? And basically these were identified to have two flavors to them, if I could put it in that way. Flavor number one is what we would call interpersonal counterproductive work behaviors. Interpersonal because these things, I have acted like they don't exist. I've been impolite to them. I've had no problem being rude to them. I've had difficulty getting along with other people. So they're counterproductive work behaviors dedicated or directed at other people, interpersonal. But there are also organizational counterproductive work behaviors. And organizational counterproductive work behaviors are things like I've taken the property of my employers, I've ignored safety rules, my employees have had rules I don't agree with, so I ignored them. All of those things are organizational. Now, there are some people who do these interpersonal things and don't do these organizational things. Vice versa is, of course, also the case. People are bad to the organization but kind to their colleagues. There are people who do both, and there are people who do neither. They don't undertake counterproductive work behaviors, either interpersonal or organizational. So that's the negative side of performance. So the first question is whether the person can get the job done. The second is whether they're likely to do bad stuff. And in conducting the literature review that we conducted to develop this presentation and also to conduct the SACS remote worker assessment, what we found is lots of reference to this characteristic called cyber slacking. That's the United States of America terminology, or cyber loafing. That's more UK based. But that's basically where people are really not working. You know, they're at home or down the local cafe or whatever, and they're just using the internet for their own satisfaction, entertainment, diversion, rather than doing work. So that's cyber slacking or cyber loafing. And quite a few studies have indicated that there are quite differential levels of a risk of cyber slacking or cyber loafing depending on the employee. So that's a potential negative or a potential issue to watch. So now that we've established that a person who is a good remote worker is somebody who maintains high levels of well-being during the experience and also gets the job done, so we have to ask the question about what sorts of things are likely to cause this person to be effective as a remote worker. And the answer is twofold, as it often is. One is that there are some characteristics which are largely genetic. We'll call that nature. And then there are some characteristics that are largely acquired in the course of life, nurture. Why nature? Well, cognitive ability tends not to change much once a person gets to a level of intellectual maturity, which for many people is sort of somewhere between 17 and 20. But personality also tends not to change much in the course of life. And twin studies indicate that both cognitive ability and personality are the majority genetically determined. So different people come up with different estimates. I mean, quite commonly, cognitive ability is estimated to be between 70 and 80% genetically determined. Personality, people might say as low as 50% genetically determined. I think it's probably somewhere around the 2/3, maybe high 60s, low 70s or something like that. But you'll get different opinions from different researchers. But then to work remotely, there are some things that you have to acquire in the course of life. Skills. You also have to have experience, and maybe even some qualifications might help. Qualifications in the sense of formal training might help equip you to work remotely. And then attributes, style, attitudes, and values. So what we're going to do is work through the intrinsic personal characteristics that cause people to be effective in working remotely. Now, this document is a ranking of recruitment predictiveness, and we're not going to spend a great deal of time on this, but ultimately this is the summary of about 50 years of research about what predicts whether somebody's going to do a good job or not. This article was written in 2001, but at SACS what we do is we update this table as new research findings are discovered. And what you see here is that you see these validity figures. The bigger they are, and they can only possibly theoretically be 1, and in fact they never get anywhere near 1, these are correlation coefficients. And so the number shows the correlation between cognitive ability and integrity. Integrity testing is a type of psych test, cognitive ability testing is a type of psych test, and job performance. And this research is typically done in real live workplaces. It's not done in laboratories. It's done in real live workplaces. You'd psych test somebody for their cognitive ability and integrity. If you haven't heard of integrity tests, that's a story for another day. Look out for one of my other presentations which deals with that in more detail. But these are two forms of psych tests. And what you find is you get a correlation, 0.65, between cognitive ability and integrity tests. So that's high. In the social sciences, a correlation of anything above 0.3 is considered to be worth knowing, particularly if it's statistically significant. And again, unless you're into stats, don't worry too much about that. But ultimately, what you see is that at the top here of this table, you have a lot of things that are to do with testing, cognitive ability, work sample testing, structured interviews, personality assessment, job knowledge tests. So you see values assessment. So you see all of these things, measures which typically involve psych testing. So structured interviews is, of course, interviews which have been structured along the lines of a proper competency analysis. That's the best way to get maximum validity out of an interview. But you see most of these things have psych test components to them. Down the bottom, you see things like age. So don't discriminate either in favour of or against people who are older or younger. Doesn't matter. Graphology is handwriting analysis. Doesn't predict success. Years of education. This is why many organisations have dumped requiring people to have degrees for specific jobs, because unless the degree is a prerequisite from some sort of a legislative point of view, you get an incredibly weak correlation between years of education and job performance. So a PhD typically does not do a better job than somebody who's just done high school, let's say. And then you have interests. You might see job experience is very low here. So job experience there. And reference checks. Reference checks are very, very weak predictors of success and failure at work. So what we did on the basis of all of that is we did a great big literature review to see what the world said about the characteristics that we've got on that league ladder of recruitment predictiveness to identify which of them predict work performance and well-being for remote workers. And so firstly, we're going to talk about a thing called cognitive ability. Now, cognitive ability is sometimes called aptitudes. It's sometimes called IQ. It's sometimes called cognitive ability. I mean, ultimately, it's got a few names. And yes, technicians will tell you there's a difference between aptitudes and IQ. I think those differences are largely unimportant. But suffice it to say, the question is, how smart are you? And there are really three things that are often measured in cognitive ability. One is a thing called verbal reasoning, which is your ability to deal with words. This is often mentioned first because, of course, it's so important for so many jobs. Then there's a thing called numerical reasoning, which is your ability to deal with numbers. And there are jobs where it's important to deal with numbers. There are jobs where it's totally unimportant. There are very few jobs where words are unimportant, but there are jobs where the fact that you can't add 2 and 2 makes no difference to your performance. And then there's a thing called abstract reasoning. And abstract reasoning is really the degree to which you can see sequences in the world about you. So that's very good from the point of view of tactics and strategy. A person who scores high on abstract reasoning is typically good at tactics and strategy, but they also tend to see the implications of things. When a person has high abstract reasoning, it means that they tend to see the implications of, if I do this, then this is likely to result. And that can be a good thing in the sense of identifying the risk associated with certain characteristics. People who are low in abstract reasoning, it's amazing how often in our coaching practice they turn up, and because we psych test everybody that we coach, and you will often find when people have low abstract reasoning, they may well run into difficulties with colleagues because they just don't understand the consequences of some of the things that they might have done. So that's verbal, numerical, and abstract reasoning. Now, to link intelligence and remote working, how effective somebody who's going to be at remote working is partially determined by their cognitive ability, particularly if they're thrown into remote working. Because people who have high levels of cognitive ability tend to learn things quickly. They tend to be able to solve problems quickly. They tend to be able to remember things better. We now know that a big component of IQ is the degree to which a person's cognitive ability, their nerves, the neural structure of their brain is set up to remember things well. So memory has a big impact on cognitive ability. So quick learners. And that tends to lead to greater flexibility. So when you sent people remote in the recent COVID-19 challenge, you might well have found that some people coped with it quickly and some people coped with it more slowly. And cognitive ability could have been a component of that. But another important component will be a thing called personality. Now, I'm going to show you the results or the model of a thing called the SACS 6. The SACS 6 is a measure of personality validated against a thing called the Hexaco model of personality. So the Hexaco is also known as the 6-factor model of personality. SACS has had many publications. I personally have had a number of publications, particularly with Jeremy Angling from Deakin University. And the model of personality that we've used in this research has been the Hexaco model of personality. And we decided to build an instrument that would be validated against the Hexaco, but would have a number of key differences. One is that all the questions in this instrument are work worded. So if you complete the Hexaco, or in fact, just about any broad bandwidth personality instrument, it's really designed for life. So the questions will be things like, I like to go to parties. I like to go to art galleries. I'm confident in a group of friends. But one of the things that we wanted to do is to create an instrument that would be a personality measure that was entirely work-worded. Why? Two reasons. One is a thing called face validity. If a person completes a psych test and they get or do not get a job, at least partially based on their results of that psych test, it's a good thing if the psych test is work-worded, because you don't have them saying, well, hang on, you choosing not to give me this job because of the way I answered a question about parties. I mean, if every question is about colleagues or work or those kinds of things, it's got greater credibility. The second thing is that we've done some validation studies of the SACS 6, and what we're finding is that we're getting slightly better, not massively better, but statistically significantly better validities. In other words, when we're trying to predict things in the real work world, we're getting better validities out of that. And the answer to that is because these things are work-worded, they're better at predicting things that are work-related. So this, in research, you would call this a proximal distal kind of effect. Proximal means that questions which are close to what you're trying to predict are much more likely to predict it accurately than questions which are a long way away. So a question about art galleries, what you're really trying to do is to assess whether a person is aesthetic in their orientation. And that can be really important for certain jobs. So if you're trying to recruit an architect, it's good if they're aesthetic in their orientation. But if you have the question that says, it's really important to me what my work looks like before it's sent out, that's a work-worded version of the same thing. And of course, it's more accurate in trying to predict work-related issues. So there are 6 personality factors, and these align to the 6 factors of the hexaco. There's also a 7th, which is not a factor. It's under each of these factors, you have 4 facets. And we've renamed some of the things that exist in the hexaco. We're not using the hexaco names because one of the other things that we wanted to do is to name this instrument as simply as possible. One of the reasons why I got into psych testing some years ago was because I was concerned that most psych tests could really truly be understood only by psychologists. And I wanted to create instruments which would be very easy for people to understand, even if they were not psychologists. So we wanted to word all of these things very plain language, and you'll see that as we go through. So this characteristic, integrity, modesty, emotionality, you're going to see that in many psych tests. Extraversion, you're going to see that in many psych tests. Everybody's come across extraversion, introversion scales. You probably haven't seen a factor called absence of anger, and I'll explain that when we go through the components. The final 2, openness to experience and conscientiousness, are very commonly expressed in psych tests for personality. And finally, soft-heartedness, which is a measure of altruism. Altruism in the sense of it doesn't fit in exactly to any of these 6, and certainly that's the way the original hexaco is structured. It's also short. It's only 125 questions, whereas the hexaco is over 200. And so that makes it quicker to complete, which our clients who are using it like, and especially the people who are completing it like that. And you get risk ratings, low, medium, and high. But we'll show you the SACS 6 report for remote working just a few slides down the track. So this is what the structure looks like. The SACS 6 personality measure has this thing called integrity, modesty. Now, Kibium Lee and Mike Ashton, who discovered the hexaco model of personality, called this honesty, humility, and they call these facets different things. Genuineness means I tell you the truth. Rule favoring means I favor rules. Absence of greed means I'm not greedy, and absence of arrogance means I'm not arrogant. And what they discovered in their research is that honesty, humility, which is the measure that correlates very heavily with this, is a very good predictor of bad behaviors. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as we work our way through. But many of you may have heard of a thing called the Big 5 model of personality. And the Big 5 model of personality is largely encompassed in these 5 things here: extraversion, conscientiousness, emotionality, absence of anger, and openness to experience. All of those 5. But the hexaco, their big discovery was this thing of integrity, of honesty, humility, which we're calling integrity, modesty. It is a predictor, by the way, of how likely you are to go to jail. People with low scores in this go to jail far more often than people with high scores. So that's a kind of a practical outcome of a psych test. So we'll go through the components in turn. Integrity, modesty. So genuineness, I don't lie. Rule favoring, I obey rules. Absence of greed, I'm not greedy, and I'm not arrogant. And what we know is that people who score well in this kind of measure, they're much more likely to do the right thing by colleagues and the organization and stakeholders. So it means that the person has an internal commitment and an awareness of what is right and wrong. And research shows that people who are high in honesty are much more likely to be effective when working from home, largely because when people are low in this characteristic, having less supervision in effect gives them the license or the feeling of freedom to do bad stuff. So that's important. Ultimately, you get less counterproductive work behaviors when people are high in honesty measures such as integrity, modesty. And one of the things that we know is that things like cyber slacking, well, if you're not that honest and nobody's watching, why wouldn't you? But we also know that counterproductive work behaviors like bullying, harassment, theft, those kinds of things take place more often when people are low in this and also not supervised. Emotionality. So going back to the question of well-being, emotionality is a big determinant of people's well-being. Now, this is very heavily genetically determined, and I sincerely hope that whoever is watching this video is low in this characteristic, because if people are very high, they basically have much less comfortable life. They have stressful lives. They have lives full of anxiety. Threat sensitivity means I'm vulnerable to threats in the world. Lack of independence means I just really don't like to strike out on my own. I like to make decisions that are supported by lots of people. And people who are overly empathic are people who feel other people's sorrow deeply. You know, the upside is that they can feel other people's joy deeply. But you can imagine if you are overly empathic, it's very difficult for you to make tough decisions because you simply don't like to look like the bad person. So this is a key director of well-being, key predictor of well-being rather, when working from home. People with low scores tend to be emotionally stable and resilient. So low emotionality, many studies have indicated that is resilience. People with high scores tend to be emotionally unstable. And so what that means is when you send somebody to work remotely, you are sending them, if they are highly emotional, into a situation where they're going to end up with less support. So if you're going to do that, you need to know that before you send them, and you need to check in with them more often, and you probably need to provide them with more structure. Formal structures like EAP might be worthwhile, but as well as that, simply checking in with them much more regularly is going to be important. So will this person get the extra support when they're working remotely? One of the things that studies have shown about remote work is that quite often remote employees feel kind of forgotten. Well, you know, I'm just here doing my stuff and nobody's checked in with me. If you're low in emotional stability, or if you're high in emotionality, then that's a risk for you. It certainly runs the risk that you're going to end up anxious, that you may end up depressed or something similar. Extraversion. So is working remotely suited to extroverts or introverts? Well, actually, introverts are better suited to working remotely than extroverts for two reasons. One is that extroverts love contact with other people. And if I am sitting in my study in my house in the suburbs and I haven't interacted with anybody because I'm really busy, then that's bad for me if I'm an extrovert. If I'm an introvert, it may be a blessed opportunity to concentrate. But if I'm an extrovert, particularly if I'm an emotionally unstable extrovert, then this isolation could be really painful for me. The next component is that you will find that with limited opportunities for interactions, people can actually become much more negative and their well-being can reduce. So it could be said that emotionally stable extroverts are perhaps suited best for working remotely. So you can imagine if you try to create your ideal remote employee, in a sense, for what we've covered so far, it might be somebody who's really smart and can get on top of things really quickly. It might be somebody who's very emotionally stable and maybe a bit introverted, perhaps not to the point of paralysis, but somebody who is introverted and comfortable to work by themselves for long periods of time and comfortable to concentrate without talking to other people. Maybe that's the perfect remote employee. But there are a couple of more components that we should look at. And this is the characteristic of absence of anger. So absence of anger is really, I don't carry grudges. I don't like to be harsh on other people. I don't have to have things my own way. In other words, I can fit into other people. And also slow to anger means I've literally got a long fuse. A person who's low in slow to anger is somebody who gets angry really quickly. Now, one of the things that we know is that people are best in any job where they're easy to relate to, they're approachable rather than cranky and difficult. It's certainly related to job performance, especially including when working remotely. But one of the things that we know is that if a person's a naturally angry person, if there are things that they don't like about their work environment, they may well reflect bitterly on that. And certainly one of the things that we know is that people who have absence of anger are likely to find that balance between the work needs and the people that they're living with. We've all experienced this, haven't we? I can't tell you the number of clients that I've spoken to in recent times where they've got their 8-year-old child sitting across from them at a desk as you're having a Zoom meeting with them. I mean, you know, some people seem to cope with that very well and comfortably, but other people tend to get cranky about it and don't seem to cope at all. So absence of anger is a good thing to have if you're going to be a remote employee. Conscientiousness. One of the things that we know is that conscientious people tend to be organized, tend to be committed to hard work. In other words, they want to achieve goals. They tend to be detail-minded so that they can focus when necessary. And they make decisions carefully, which means that they don't tend to do things impulsively. So not surprisingly, job performance is related to conscientiousness. But when working from home, this seems to be a little more important, largely because you're operating without supervision. And so people who are high in conscientiousness tend to procrastinate less. And they also more likely to be organised, diligent, and self-disciplined. And one of the things that's a challenge about working remotely for many people is that they have to create their own structure. The structure is not there. And I have a presentation coming up in a couple of weeks about how to lead people when they're remote workers. So this presentation is all focused on what type of person can work well remotely, but that will be much more about leading people remotely. And one of the things that I will emphasize is that you actually have to consciously structure people's jobs more when they're working remotely than you do if they're working in the office, because you get these unintended kind of almost accidental supervisory opportunities just as you're walking past their desk or maybe in the coffee room or something of that nature. Finally, from a personality point of view, we have this characteristic called openness to experience. Now, openness to experience is a personality characteristic that has been known about forever. As long as we've been looking at personality, we've known that some people like new stuff, they're broad-minded, and some people don't like new stuff. So openness to experiences, things like cares about appearances, which means that's the aesthetic component. They believe that it's important to have things looking good. They're curious about the world. They like to be creative. They're comfortable with the unfamiliar. So the degree to which a person's naturally inquisitive can affect their degree to adapt to new working arrangements. So particularly if they've got high IQ, the combination of high IQ and openness to experience can make them good at adapting to new working environments. So if you're asked to work remotely and you've never done it before, somebody with high openness to experience is much more likely to cope with that comfortably. So values. Now, this is a thing called the SACS value scale. This is also the fruit of a research partnership with Deakin University. And in fact, Simon Albrecht, myself, and Nick Brandon Jones had a publication just this very year, as a matter of fact, measuring values at work. So we took the work of a gentleman by the name of Shalom Schwartz, who's one of the world's most famous researchers in values, and he identified 10 values in life. We wanted to apply that research to work, so values at work. And we're measuring a bunch of things that we think are really practical questions about people's values at work. Firstly, let me differentiate between values and personality. Personality is personality is a kind of an intrinsic tendency to like and feel comfortable with certain things and to dislike and feel uncomfortable with other things. So a person who is a true introvert doesn't particularly like being the center of attention. They would prefer to be in the background. They have strengths. They tend to be good at concentrating for long periods of time and to focus on things. So the extrovert, on the other hand, hates being by him or herself for a long time. They tend to often to be very empathic in the way that they relate to other people. They're very interested to hear other people's opinions, to be in the know in terms of what people think, those kinds of things. So that's kind of intrinsic. Values, on the other hand, are beliefs. They're in effect goals. They're things that I believe are important. So you see this candidate is very high in social justice, which means that he or she believes that people should be treated equally, no matter what stratum of society they come from, no matter what their ethnic or religious background is. People should be treated fairly. This person also clearly believes in environmental sustainability. How does this relate to work performance in remote working? Well, these things don't affect things very much indeed, but a belief that it's important to be autonomous, which means I make my own decisions. There is strong research evidence that people who take that view can be more suited to working remotely, largely because values give people a sense of comfort. So if my values match the workplace that I'm working in, my colleagues, my work situation, then I'm far more likely to be comfortable than if they don't. And so if I believe that it's a good thing to have autonomy, make my own decisions, then I'm far more likely to be comfortable working remotely. If I believe, well, actually, no, I should obey other people, and you can see this person's commitment to authority is relatively low, maybe this is an indicator that this person won't be as comfortable with remote working than someone else would say up here in autonomy. All right, so this slide just says what I just said. So but it cites the research. By the way, there is a reference page at the end of this presentation, so you can, if you're interested in following up any of these many research articles that we're quoting, you can take that up directly with them, or if you want to talk to us about it, then don't hesitate. We can help you access some of these things. So we've talked about personality and we've talked about competencies, and I'm going to show you a remote worker assessment which is based on personality and competencies in just a little while. But I thought that, I'm going to show you a remote worker assessment which is based on personality and values. Competencies are something entirely different, and typically we don't psych test competencies. Competencies are learned. They tend to fall into the category of skills or experience or knowledge and other characteristics, and the other characteristics might be things like attitudes. So in psychology, in organizational psychology, we often talk about KSAOs. So competency analysis, its early life was really in organizational and educational psychology, and org psychs kind of developed the early competency models. Now, anybody who's ever picked up an HR textbook knows that some of these competency models have been made very articulated and very complex. I personally am strongly against that. I think that competencies are best developed locally. I'm not a big fan of giant competency diaries, but that's another issue. Don't get me started. Now, I thought I'd quote, a gentleman by the name of Bartram in 2005, in fact, he started this work much earlier, but he developed a thing called the Great 8 competency model, which is, he studied a whole bunch of jobs, and what he was really trying to do is to identify competencies that would relate to an extremely wide range of jobs. So in a number of jobs, you need to lead and you need to decide. And leadership just doesn't mean I'm the boss. So if you're in customer service and you have to cause a customer to get a good solution, well, that's a leadership exercise. So you've got leading and deciding. You've got supporting and cooperating. Well, in every workplace, that's necessary. You need to support people, you need to cooperate. Interacting and presenting, which means I'm going to, so going back to retail, I'm going to show this customer what this thing is that I'm trying to sell him or her, and that's interacting or presenting. Analysing and interpreting, I think everybody gets what that is. Creating and conceptualising means I'm coming up with new things, maybe I'm writing things, maybe I'm designing things. Organising and executing, that's the sort of practical stuff of getting things done. Adapting and coping, that's all about adjusting to the world. That's a resilience competency, if you want to put it that way. Enterprising and performing, that's achieving things, and it's also things like growth and development in your organisation. So how does this all relate to the world of remote work? So one of the things that we know from this Crum, Kanthak, Hartman and Hurtle article is that they identified 2 of these key competencies, these grade 8 competencies, as being particularly important for remote work. So these competencies, analysing, interpreting, which is the ability of making sense of things that are around you, and leading and deciding. And of course, if you're by yourself, well, of course, you've got to work out what things mean by yourself. And leading and deciding, well, if you're sitting around by yourself waiting for specific instructions, then you're unlikely to succeed. So perhaps not surprisingly, things like initiative, autonomy, goal setting, they were found to be more important in virtual teams than in traditional teams, largely because with the less intensive supervision that people receive, they have to do these things for themselves rather than wait for the boss to do them for them. Further stuff on competencies, 2 researchers by the name of Wang and Hegarty came up with the concept of individual virtual competences. So key KSAOs required to perform effectively when working virtually. So the first they mentioned was a thing called virtual self-efficacy. So just to recap, I mentioned this before, self-efficacy is the capacity to believe that you can cope, that you can get this stuff done. I'm sure that as you've seen people move to remote work, you've seen some people take to it like a duck to water and, hey, I like this and this is fun and yeah, I'm confident I can do good work. So that's virtual self-efficacy. When a person doesn't believe and maybe they're making contact a lot and asking for help, then that's a lack of virtual self-efficacy. Then there's virtual media skill. Now, media can be anything from, hey, we have to access all these SharePoint documents. It could be, yeah, we have to have Zoom meetings or Microsoft Teams meetings or whatever. In other words, you need to be comfortable and confident with the media that you're using to create your work. And then there are virtual social skills. I mean, the world is replete with stories about how after COVID-19 rolled in, all of a sudden we have to learn this new way of doing business. We have to learn new ways of interacting with our colleagues. Well, they're virtual social skills, aren't they? We don't do it like we did when we were around the water cooler. We do it a different way now that we're doing it virtually. So individual virtual competence was found to have a positive effect on individual work outcomes in virtual settings. So what that means is if you train people on virtual self-efficacy or coach them or guide them or supervise them, virtual media skills and virtual social skills, you could make them better remote workers. And Hurdle and colleagues in 2006 developed a set of KSAOs related to telecooperation. And you see that a lot of these competences overlap with each other. They said creativity and independence. Now, independence is not a million miles from virtual self-efficacy, nor is it that far from the research that we cited on the previous page. Creativity is about getting stuff done, so strongly contributed to the prediction of team performance. So Georgia, my colleague, put this slide together which summarised what the world of competency analysis says about remote working. And it says that from a competency point of view, it's a good thing if you are able to lead and decide. So you've got to take initiative, you've got to exercise autonomy, and it's good if you're able to set your own goals. Analysing and interpreting, so you're using digital media, you're communicating and you're analysing information that comes to you. Telecooperation, which is about a combination of creativity and independence. Creativity in the sense of I will get stuff done, and independence, I will not wait for somebody to tell me what to do. And you can see the link there with this competency model about leading and deciding. Virtual self-efficacy, belief that you have the ability to accomplish work tasks virtually, and self-confidence. And virtual media skills, technology skills, ability to communicate and work virtually. Virtual social skills, ability to build relationships virtually. So let me take you to something else that I think is really important. I believe that the world of work is incredibly poorly served from skills development related to building these competencies. And I have seen many organizations that have wonderful instruments and technologies for assessing whether an employee's workplace is likely to be safe when they're working remotely, but have they identified A, whether the person's suited, and B, do they have good methods for teaching them about how to work remotely? And the answer is, I haven't seen an organization yet. Please get in touch with me if you have a learning and development process about how to work remotely. You will be the first I have ever seen, despite the fact that I've spoken to many, many organizations about this. So I'm going to suggest it's worthwhile running a learning needs analysis and then build a development program that helps people to develop these virtual skills. Develop organizational how-to materials. So, they could be infographics, they could be checklists, they could be coaching sessions, whatever. And then what you've got to do is you've got to develop relevant performance development materials. One of the things that we know is that performance development is done particularly poorly with remote employees. And in the session that I'm running about how to lead remote employees, I'll be dwelling on this quite a bit. What is a good performance development process and how can you tailor it? How can you adapt it to work well with remote employees? Because you're losing all of that day by day stuff of, hey, that was great, thank you. Well, actually, next time I'd like you to do it differently. So that's an important question. One of the things that you might like to do is to use 360-degree feedback to evaluate the capacity for leaders to lead remote teams. Because for many leaders, they can be great at leading in the flesh, but they just don't know what the skills are to lead people in a remote situation. And I think there should be leadership development for how to lead people remotely. Once more, consider attending my event about how to lead people remotely. Going back to the question of leaders though, you remember what I said about what makes a good employee from a remote point of view? So emotionally stable, honest, smart, not angry, conscientious and hardworking, broad-minded. Well, of course, that goes doubly for leaders. Leaders who don't have those capacities are highly unlikely to create an effective remote team, or they're going to have to exercise a lot more effort to do so. And so then, once you've identified your learning needs analysis and you've developed your materials, you're going to have to build competencies by coaching, training, and development. So out of all of the stuff to do with personality and values assessment and cognitive ability, we created an instrument called the SACS Remote Worker Test. So the SACS Remote Worker Test can be used with cognitive ability or just with personality and values, but its purpose is to help organizations understand how a particular employee is likely to thrive and have high levels of well-being and perform well in a remote work environment. And so we based this on all of the studies that, well, further studies, but many of the studies that have been mentioned in this presentation. And so this is what it looks like. It measures a bunch of characteristics that are related to a person's capacity to work independently. This is based on the SACS Personality instrument and SACS values. So we're saying somebody who isn't too low in autonomy is a good thing. Somebody who's smart enough, we're setting relatively gentle cut scores there. We're looking for people who've got a decent resilience capability. They really shouldn't be that angry. They should be conscientious. They should be honest and straightforward. They shouldn't be overly emotional, and they shouldn't be massively extroverted. So if a person is suited to remote work, they get a big green tick based on all of these little green ticks that, and we're saying the cut score here is about 70%. If a person gets 7 out of 10 of these things, then they're going to have a big green tick. If they get less than that, then they're going to have a big red cross. So that allows you at a glance to see whether a person is suited to a remote working environment. If you're interested in that, then go to our website. You can see how to get a free trial of the SACS Remote Worker Test. So to draw some conclusions. Firstly, cognitive ability, personality, values, competencies, that's what makes a good remote worker. And a good remote worker, just to recap, is somebody who has high levels of well-being as they work remotely and they can get the job done. And part of getting the job done is that they don't do bad stuff like bully people, harass people, ignore them, snub them, steal things, those kinds of things. There's this instrument called the SACS Remote Worker Test now. And if things aren't going well with a remote worker, well, maybe you might like to assess the core competencies. So you're recruiting for strong core characteristics. And you can build a development plan for competencies. Now, this applies to both staff and leaders. And if you're interested in 360-degree feedback to identify whether a particular leader may well be suited to leading people in a remote location, then don't hesitate to get in touch. So that's what we wanted to cover today. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that your next decision to send somebody remote is a successful one. And what we've tried to do is to make it clearer to you about the kinds of things that you should look at to identify whether that's the case or not.